This is our gardening and landscaping webinar on shade gardening in Central Florida. And so I want to welcome you on behalf of the University of Florida IFAS Extension Polk County, gardening in Central Florida. So just want to go over a few of the topics that we'll cover today. And so we're going to start off with the Florida-friendly landscaping principles. Then we'll look at the benefits of shade gardens. I think oftentimes people sometimes can be bummed when they have, shade in the landscape and they think there's nothing to grow, but I think there's lots of benefits to a shade garden, so we'll discuss some of those. Then we'll talk about varying degrees of shade. We say, does your landscape have shade? Well, it may, but what type of shade? And so we'll talk about the different types of shade. We'll look at some tips for gardening with shade in the landscape. It's going to be very similar to the rest of gardening, but we'll look at a few of those tips. And then we'll also look at a few shade-tolerant plants. There are so many shade-tolerant plants. Certainly we couldn't cover them all today, but I think we've selected a few uncommon plants as well as some more common plants so that you can kind of spruce up your shade garden. So first, we want to start with explaining Florida-friendly landscaping. So Florida-friendly landscaping is the foundation for all gardening here in Florida. And so if we're going to talk about gardening in the shade in Central Florida, we need to understand Florida-friendly landscaping. And so this is a program through the University of Florida, and it's a way to maintain our landscapes all while reducing our inputs of water, fertilizer, and pesticides, and still maintaining beautiful landscapes that help protect our natural resources. And so the foundation of the program is right plant, right place. If we start off with putting the right plant in the right place, and so today talking about shade, so choosing plants that are shade tolerant for our shady spots in the landscape, those plants are going to be able to thrive. They'll be less susceptible to pest and disease problems. Next, we want to water efficiently. Certainly we know that water is a precious resource, and so we don't want to waste it by overwatering, but additionally, overwatering doesn't necessarily benefit our plants and sometimes can be detrimental. We want to make sure that we water appropriately. Additionally, we want to fertilize appropriately. And so something you'll hear repeated today is fertilizer cannot make up for the wrong plant in the wrong place. And so if you put a shade-loving plant in the sun, you cannot fertilize it enough to make it, to improve its appearance and its health and vice versa. And so certainly we want to use fertilizer when appropriate. We want to use the right amount, the right type. We don't want to fertilize right before a heavy rainstorm. That could lead to stormwater runoff, which we'll talk about, or pollution associated with that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We want to utilize mulch, and we'll talk about ways to use mulch in the shade garden. We want to attract wildlife, and so shade gardens provide a great opportunity for that. With so much development in Florida, we have eliminated some of the natural habitats for wildlife, and so it's our job as gardeners to provide that habitat for wildlife in our landscapes, and certainly in our shade gardens we can do that. We want to manage yard pests responsibly, so that involves getting out there, looking in the landscape, knowing what a healthy plant looks like, investigating when we see signs of damage, looking under leaves, checking for what might be the cause. Maybe it's an insect, maybe it's not, maybe we have put the wrong plant in the wrong place, and so this plant is stressed out and not able to thrive. And so instead of just seeing a pest and trying to treat it, it's all about, an overall looking at, other factors that might be affecting this plant. Recycling yard waste is another way of practicing Florida-friendly landscaping. Very simple. When you mow your lawn, you can leave your grass clippings on the lawn. That's a way to recycle yard waste instead of bagging them up and taking them to the trash. Letting leaves, fallen leaves, as a self-mulching area, and we'll talk about that today. And additionally, you could start a compost pile and recycle your yard waste there. Reducing stormwater runoff is pretty important. Here in Florida, we have a pretty decent rainy season, and so with all of that rain, we have a lot of pollution associated with that. And so oftentimes in our landscapes and in different areas throughout the state and businesses, we don't have enough permeable space. And so rain falls on a roof, maybe we have gutters and downspouts, the water goes there. Hopefully those are directed into our landscapes and our lawn areas, but oftentimes we don't have enough space. And so that water runs down our impermeable sidewalks or impermeable driveways, down our roadways, picks up pollutants along the way, and then ends up in stormwater ponds or in natural bodies of water. And so anytime we can try to keep that stormwater on site, let it filter on site, maybe through a rain garden, maybe by directing our downspouts into our garden areas, utilizing rain barrels. And so all of those ways will help reduce stormwater runoff. And then finally, we want to protect the waterfront. Here in Florida, of course, we're a peninsula, so we're surrounded on 3 sides by water, but locally we have lakes and rivers and different bodies of water. And so we want to protect that. And so with Florida Friendly Landscaping, we would encourage you to maintain a 10-foot no maintenance zone. We would encourage you to not use fertilizer or pesticides, and if possible, to not mow in that area as well. So those are the 9 principles of Florida Friendly Landscaping. They're pretty simple to follow, and so I would encourage you to, you're probably already utilizing all of these, and so, as you're gardening, as you're landscaping, think about how you can incorporate these into your landscape. So next we'll talk about the benefits of shade gardens. So why would you want to, garden in the shade? Why would you want to keep your shade garden? Well, it's a cool escape, right? It's a place, when you're working outside, and you need to take a quick little break, where's the one place you want to stop in? The shady part of the garden. It's a little cooler there. There's usually a place to rest there because we enjoy it so much. And so I would encourage you, if you do have an area in the landscape that's shaded, provide some type of seating maybe so that you have that place to kind of cool off and take a break. Additionally, shade gardens can provide privacy or screening. And so by utilizing shrubs and trees in those areas, we can create a barrier, maybe for whatever we don't, that might be next door. Or if you just want a little place to escape, again, you have that privacy screening through a shade garden. Additionally, shade gardens can provide habitat for wildlife, both through the plants, the vertical layering that can be utilized in those design concepts. We can choose plants that provide fruiting berries or something for wildlife as well. Additionally, shade gardens may have a little bit easier maintenance in that, there's not as much sun. Potentially, they might be a little bit drier. And so maybe we have less weeds to deal with. Maybe we have those fallen leaves, they're creating less of an opportunity for weeds to pop up. And so, we could utilize plants that are drought tolerant, and so we don't have to water these plants as much, and so we have a lot less maintenance. Of course, there's environmental benefits. We can save energy. Oftentimes, shade gardens are associated with shade trees, and so those trees can provide cooling effects in the summer, and then if they're deciduous, they can let light through in the winter. For warming, they could create a windbreak potentially. Also, these shade garden areas could provide less erosion through the trees and the roots and the plants that we utilize in those areas. And then another bonus benefit of shade gardens is that we have a little bit of frost protection for some of our more cold, tender plants in the garden under trees. And so we can provide some of those kind of subtropical plants that thrive in those shady conditions can live in that shade garden and may not be affected by frost or cooler temperatures. So with shade, there's varying degrees of shade. There's not just one type of shade. And so when we think about shade, we need to think about when and where does this shade occur? Think about the position of your home. Maybe, does the back of your home receive morning sun and then afternoon shade? Maybe does your side yard receive morning shade and then afternoon sun? And so it's important to think about where this shade occurs and when does it occur. We know that a lot of shade tolerant plants are going to do better with that morning sun and afternoon shade versus morning shade and maybe an intense afternoon sun, depending on how long that is. That may not be the best spot for shade tolerant plants. Additionally, we want to think about shade shifting. Even throughout the day, If you have an area with pine trees, often that can be referred to as kind of shifting shade. Seasonally, shade can shift as well, both through just naturally with the tilt of the earth, how the earth is tilted and where the sun kind of hits in different seasons. But additionally, if we have deciduous trees, again, in the spring and summer, they're going to be full of leaves, but and then in the winter, they lose their leaves, and so they provide more light in. So that's something to think about. And then as trees grow as well, that's going to vary how much shade hits an area. As that canopy increases, more shade might become available. So here's an example, kind of that shifting shade that you might see. And so, this spot may not be shaded all the time, but in varying parts of the day, the shade kind of shifts around. And so tried to provide a few examples. We can describe these, and we're going to get into depth a little bit more on the different types of shade, but I think it's important to try to see what this different shade might look like. So we thought about, when does the shade occur? Where does it occur? But then what degree of shade are we receiving? I think it's important to start with noting what is full sun. And so full sun would be at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. So that's our basis. So we know full sun, 6 or more hours. Then we have these varying degrees. So we have light shade, partial shade, full shade, and then dense shade, which we'll get into in just a minute. So starting with light shade. So this is little or no direct sun. Receives maybe 3 to 5 hours of sun. Could be under trees. Locations that are sunny enough that sun-loving plants and shade-tolerant plants can both thrive in these areas. And so you can see featured here, this is a location at our Florida Friendly Landscaping Demonstration Garden at our Extension office in Bartow. And so in this area, we have green island ficus and the variegated shell ginger both are able to thrive in this kind of light shade condition. This area does include a building, which that's another source of shade. It also has a gazebo and it does have some trees nearby. And so, but there are some open spaces as well. And so it's not, it's just a kind of light shade. It still gets, a few hours of sun. Then we have partial shade or dappled shade. And so here, again, just a few hours of sun, maybe some dappled shade under trees, receives about 2 hours of sun, or it could be shaded for about half the day. And so think about in your landscape, maybe do you have an area like this? Do you have a lot of large oak trees or other shade trees around that might provide this kind of partial shade in certain areas of the landscape? And then we have full shade. And so this is constant shade throughout the year. It doesn't change with the seasons. Less than an hour of sun. And there are some plants that will thrive in these conditions. But again, I think that's an important part of this, is knowing that not one shade plant is necessarily right for all of the spots. And it's all about right plant, right place, and matching these plants and their varying tolerances of shade to these varying degrees of shade. And so again, full shade, this might be caused by some trees, maybe a fence, a building, something like that. So it's full shade, so it still has some degree of sunlight reaching, but not very much. And then finally, we have dense shade, or also known as difficult shade. We have a lot fewer plant options here. It can be pretty difficult to grow in these areas, maybe because of tree roots, maybe extreme moisture conditions, either very moist or very dry. It could be in the shadow of a building and just never receives light, and so it could be very difficult to grow. I put a picture of a cave, so you might think kind of cave conditions. If you've got, certainly don't have a cave in your landscape, but maybe you have one of these spots where just nothing is going to grow. There's just no sun reaching, difficult soil conditions. And so I would encourage you to not be dismayed. We're going to talk about a few options that you can utilize in this area of the landscape. Think about some other options. So certainly using mulch in that area, because you're going to want something on the ground just bare soil will erode away. And so we don't want areas of just completely bare soil. You know, at least a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch, maybe some permeable pavers throughout that area. Again, you might be dealing with pretty major tree roots, so just use caution with what would be most appropriate for your yard. Certainly garden art, benches and different forms of outdoor art might help brighten that area or add, you know, to that area, kind of creating maybe an outdoor room in that area, since it's really not an option to grow any plants there beside the trees or whatever else might be there. And then you might also think about, you can grow plants, but they might have to be in pots. And so think about maybe pots that you could utilize that are brightly colored or would accent that area. And then you can utilize shade tolerant plants in those pots if you aren't able to dig in the ground. So that's just something to consider as well. So, you know, that difficult shade, it may just be because of the conditions. It may just be because of tree roots or the soil, extreme soil moisture. And so, you know, plants may be an option, but they may have to be in a pot. So some design ideas for your shade garden. One way to really brighten that part of the yard would be to use light colored flowers or brightly colored flowers. Those are going to pop against kind of the dark green foliage. Additionally, choosing plants with lighter green or maybe that chartreuse green color would really pop against dark green leaves in the landscape. Certainly creating layers, we can create depth, and certainly as you can see in this photo, shade gardens can be really beautiful and really interesting through the use of texture and color and these layers and pops of light colors against the darker colors. I think, you know, it doesn't just have to be a boring garden. It can be, you know, one of your favorite spots in the garden. And certainly if you are one of the people that you have just varying degrees of shade throughout the landscape, creating interest, creating different garden areas is certainly possible with these design ideas. Here's another, 2 more photos. You know, within your shade garden, just get creative. You know, certainly we don't want to overdo the yard art. That can be a little too much sometimes, but just a pop here or there can really add to the enjoyment of the garden, help fill in some voids or some spaces maybe. And so we do have lots of options still. So when you think about the installation and maintenance of your shade garden, of course, we want to utilize right plant, right place. Again, it's important for you to take some time and try to understand what type of shade do you have. You know, again, if it's that afternoon shade, that's great. And, you know, there are plants that also can tolerate varying degrees of shade. So, you know, doing research, finding out what plants are going to thrive in that area, and you'll be much more successful. One thing to consider in shade gardens that are near or under or around trees is to think about those tree roots. And so we don't want to do a lot of digging. We don't want to be creating large planting holes. And so if we can utilize smaller plants, we can dig smaller planting holes and not disturb the roots too much in those areas. Again, remember those tree roots and those plants that you install are both going to be competing for water and nutrients in the soil. And so we don't want to overdo it, but certainly there are a lot of shade tolerant plants that will thrive near or around oak tree or any shade tree. Of course, when we establish these plants, we want to water them frequently. I would encourage you to choose drought tolerant plants that after establishment, you won't need to get out and water. Sometimes these shade gardens can be, you know, not convenient to installing irrigation or near irrigation, you know, a watering hose. And so, you know, if you can hand water to establish, then they're drought tolerant and they'll thrive without additional irrigation after that. Certainly the tree roots might be an issue for trying to install irrigation depending on what type. And so that's just something to consider. Utilizing those fallen leaves, if your shade garden is near a tree that tends to lose some of its leaves or shed some of its leaves, Instead of constantly raking those up, think about just letting those stay there and creating what's called a self-mulching area. And so those leaves would over time just fall, and they would help prevent soil erosion. And additionally, those leaves are going to break down and provide nutrients from the soil that plants can then take up. And so again, that's recycling yard waste in a way as well. Of course, we want to remove weeds as needed, but when we think about our gardens in the shade, potentially they have less weeds than our full sun areas. Certainly they're not without. I wouldn't say they're weed free, but oftentimes there's different types of weeds that might grow in these areas. So now we'll look at some characteristics and some shade tolerant plants. This is not an all-inclusive list. We can only include so many plants here, and there are so many shade tolerant plants. If you've ever thought, I really don't even know what would work here, I think there are lots of options to choose from, but we've tried to select maybe some unusual ones or and some common plants that are readily available that might help brighten and add to ease of maintenance of your shade garden. So first, we want to look at the characteristics of shade tolerant plants. So these are just some kind of general characteristics. Not every shade tolerant plant fits this mold, but plants maybe with broad leaves. Another category we can think about are house plants, also known as foliage plants. I would just use a word of caution, and with all of these plants, or with any planting, just make sure the plants are not invasive before installing. The University of Florida has an assessment of non-native plants, and we'll send that link out. You can check there for the status of plants to find out if they're invasive. I've highlighted, a lot of ferns will grow in the shade, but you want to be cautious not to just put any fern out in the landscape. Several ferns are invasive and are a problem here in Florida, and so we want to be very careful. Certainly you can utilize native ferns. We've got a list, a link we'll send out at the end with a list of ferns that you can use, but that IFAS assessment is available to help you check on the status of plants to make sure what you're putting out there won't be a problem. Some tropical perennials, we talked about one of the benefits of the shade garden is that we have that protection from frost, or some protection. I wouldn't say it's you can put any plant out there, any tropical plant in your shade garden, but some of those borderline frost tender plants might be able to survive if, they're in the shade garden or, of course, located in the right place in the landscape. And then, of course, some native woodland plants. We have native plants to Florida that thrive in these conditions that we're trying to fill the void in. And so by utilizing these Florida-friendly or Florida native plants, we can certainly fill our shade gardens with plants. I think it's important to think about the characteristics of these shade tolerant plants, and then what is the best light for generally shade tolerant plants. So we want to avoid an area that has midday sun from maybe 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That sun is going to be too hot and too intense for these shade tolerant plants. These plants could look burned, they could start looking yellow or bronzy, and they might lose some of the color. And additionally, not even just their appearance might not look nice, but these plants are then stressed. And so then they're more susceptible to pest and disease problems when they're not in the right place. Another characteristic of the light would be 4 or few hours of full sun. Think about maybe, that morning sun. That's, we hear that a lot. And so morning sun, afternoon shade, that's a good location for some of these shade tolerant plants. Dappled shade all day, there's lots of shade tolerant plants that will thrive in those conditions. And then that high kind of shifting shade that you might see under the pine trees, that's another area for shade tolerant plants. Again, it's all about right plant, right place. So a little research into what type of shade you're experiencing, and then what plants can tolerate that light, and then even thinking about the mature size of those plants. Will these plants fit in this location? We buy our little 1-gallon plants, but Oftentimes they grow beyond that, so it's important to know the mature size of the plant as well. I also wanted to quickly mention a few plants that are not going to thrive in your shade garden. Certainly under your oak tree is not the best spot for your vegetable garden. And so many fruits and vegetable crops or plants are going to need at least partial to full, mostly full sun to flower and then produce fruit. And so certainly there are edible plants that will thrive in shade gardens, but I think that's a whole nother topic. So just kind of thinking about that. And then also with your turf grass or your lawn, most turf grasses are not going to thrive in shade conditions, but there are some cultivars, especially of St. Augustine, that will thrive in those lower light conditions, maybe 4 hours of light. So we think back to maybe that light shade conditions, they might thrive in those areas. And so just thinking about the maintenance of your lawn, if it is in a, a light shaded area, you want to keep it mowed at a higher height. Additionally, less inputs of water and fertilizer. And if you can avoid, lots of walking or driving on the grass in that area, it's going to help that grass thrive. If this is an area where you need to walk frequently, creating some type of path with either pavers or mulch would help with the wear and just create that walking path so that you don't wear different patterns in the lawn there. So here are the plants. Again, it's not an all-inclusive list, but I think these are some good choices to get you started. And so the first is mondo grass. Often this is confused with liriope, but mondo grass is a much narrower blade. It's not a true grass. It is, a broadleaf plant, even though it has a very thin leaf. It's a clumping plant, and so, especially when you look at either of these photos, on the left we have kind of the regular full-size mondo grass, which could reach up to 2 feet. And then there's also the dwarf, which you can see on the right, and that only reaches a few inches in height. And so I think it's a great option if you really were missing turf grass in the shade area. Utilizing that dwarf mondo grass can really give you that look. Again, this is a clumping grass, so you can install a few of them, and then over time they're going to clump out and fill in. And I think it's important to create some kind of a pathway through these, as well as they don't have wear tolerance, so walking over them would not be an option for the plant, but creating that pathway throughout. And they certainly thrive in varying degrees of shade in the landscape. Next up, another ground cover option would be peacock ginger. Now, this blooms throughout the summer. It has little purple or pink flowers. It's really well known for the leaves, and you can see in the 2 different photos here of the different species of peacock ginger, how the color and the patterns on the leaves vary. This is a deciduous plant, so in the winter it will go dormant, but don't worry, in the spring it will pop back up, and then you'll have that ground cover there. And so I think it's good to have some type of mulch or letting leaves there, so that you don't have that bare soil to erode away, that during the winter you still have a covering over that area. Might be a good idea to also mark that spot of the garden so that you're not surprised when that plant comes back up in the spring, and certainly so you don't pull it out thinking it's a weed or something that you've forgotten, all of those 2 to 3 winter months, all of a sudden you've forgotten that you had peacock ginger in your garden. This is a native ground cover that you might consider using, creeping sage. And so it can form a low, dense cover, and it does survive in the shade. It has this tiny little blue flower. Now it can spread more than you may prefer. So just, again, with a lot of spreading ground covers, that's something to consider is, how much area do you really want to cover? And is, what type of ground cover is best, a spreading or a clumping kind of ground cover? But this is a native ground cover option that you might consider, kind of inconspicuous, but again, with a close-up view, you can see those tiny little blue flowers. Caladiums, I think most of us are familiar with these plants. They're known for their beautiful leaves. There are two different types of caladiums. There are the fancy-leafed caladiums, and then there are the lance-leafed caladiums. So the fancy-leafed are more of the heart shape, whereas the lance-leaf are more narrow. There's so many cultivars to choose from, and they're a great surprise. Again, these go dormant in the winter, but they pop back up every spring, are there with you all summer, and just really add a nice pop of color to the landscape, particularly in these shade gardens. You know, and so we would encourage you to use flowering plants when possible, but also think about the foliage of different plants and how that can really enhance the landscape. Bromeliads are another common plant to use in shade garden areas. There are so many different genuses and genus and species of bromeliads, and so certainly you want to make sure that you match bromeliads to your light conditions, because there are some sun-loving bromeliads, and so you wouldn't want to put the wrong, you know, a sun-loving bromeliad in the shade or vice versa. Certainly the plant will tell you with the way that it appears, and then again how it performs. You know, it won't perform as well if it's not in the right light conditions. But bromeliads offer really great a show of their flower spikes, and so that can be a pop. One thing you want to keep in mind when using bromeliads in the landscape is you want to flush them frequently. They often have these cups that hold water, and so that can be an opportunity for container mosquitoes to breed in. And so if you just flush those cups with water pretty frequently, maybe once or twice a week, you can keep those container mosquitoes from, you'll flush out the larvae, and so the mosquitoes won't continue to develop. Additionally, you could use BT granules. That's a natural product that will disrupt the larvae of mosquitoes in those cups. But they're beautiful. Just keep in mind with container mosquitoes that we want to keep those cups flushed out or use those granules. Cassandra is a great flowering perennial that we can use in you know, some of our shade gardens. This beautiful plant grows to about 3 feet tall. It has these beautiful kind of bright orange flowers that can really pop out against their kind of glossy green leaves and really brighten parts of a shade garden. So that's just another option. And of course, they can be a little tender to cold, and so with the cover of trees, that will help them to survive during those cold times. This is a native plant, rouge plant, and so you know, we're kind of highlighting varying Florida-friendly and Florida native plants. You know, Florida non-native or Florida native plants. And so rouge plant is kind of a small little 3 to 4 foot plant. Has these tiny little white flowers that are great for pollinators, and then it produces these red berries that are great for birds. It's an evergreen, and so it survives through freezes. It's great for drought tolerance. And so it's a small little, I would call it a, you know, kind of a small shrub, 3 to 4 feet. If it does end up getting kind of leggy in the landscape, you can prune it back in late winter and then just kind of let it'll fill back in and grow out. So that's just another option in your shade garden. Wild coffee is a little more common, another Florida native shrub. This plant can get 4 to 10 feet tall and spread just as wide. It's known for its puckered, glossy, dark green leaves. And then it produces, and right now it's flowering, these tiny little white flowers, great for pollinators. Even in the shade garden, I've seen pollinators on these flowers. And then it produces a berry that resembles the fruit of the true coffee plant. However, it is different. It's a different species from the coffee plant that has caffeine that we brew our coffee from. This is a native alternative that thrives in our shade gardens. Beautyberry is another native plant that is shade tolerant. It's great, a great seasonal plant, I think. Right now it's putting on its flowers. You can see there on the right, the tiny little pinkish purple flowers. And then in early fall, it'll start to form those beautiful berries. It'll lose its leaves and then just have those beautiful purple berries, where it gets its common name from beautyberry. Those are edible. Of course, it's a great source of food for wildlife. And so, and of course, that purple color adds a great pop in the landscape as well. I wanted to include a palm, and there are several palms that you can include in your shade garden. Needle palm is a native kind of shrubby palm that you can include. It gets its common name from these needles that are found along the base of the trunk. It's very slow growing, but after established, this is going to be very drought tolerant in the landscape. So if you kind of want to add that palm look to your shade garden, needle palm is one option for that. Oak leaf hydrangea is another native plant, especially if you're looking for kind of some fall color. This plant will give you that, in that, towards the winter, the leaves will start to turn color. It has that beautiful leaf shape, those beautiful white flowers, can reach 6 to 10 feet tall. But another great shrub option for your shade garden. And then finally, pinwheel jasmine is not a native plant, but it is a great Florida-friendly shrub. Blooms just about year-round. Certainly during the warm months, it blooms very consistently, covered in beautiful white flowers. Now, it's not a true jasmine, as you can see from the scientific name there. So it's not fragrant like jasmine would be, but the flowers are just stunning, and the abundance of flowers, of course, and that's a light colored flower to kind of add a pop in that shade garden. Dark, glossy green leaves. And so if you're looking for, consistent flowering, a great shrub for your shade garden, I would certainly recommend pinwheel jasmine. If you're looking for more resources on shade tolerant plants, we've got a few